10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. At 5:29 and 45 seconds, the bomb detonates. The light is brighter than the sun. Observing the explosion, Oppenheimer recalls a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
This terrifying weapon would launch the United States on a journey, turning the refuge of the Founding Fathers into a militarized state.
That's the whole series.
It's a segment from the Untold History of the United States, a 10-part documentary on the history of U.S. foreign policy, now airing Mondays at 8 Eastern on Showtime. And joining us at the table now, Peter Kuznick. Thank you for being here. You collaborated with Oliver on this project. How did this come about, this series? Why did it come about?
Briefly, I'll just introduce you, Peter. He was teaching at American University a course in my films in 1996, and we talked, and because I grew up in New York City and the bomb was dropped the year before I was born. I never really questioned the atomic bomb, ever. All my life, I assumed, because there was a movie or two, but it wasn't really something that I dealt with. I asked him what was the bomb about, because he's an expert on the 1930 scientists. And he told me the Henry Wallace story from 1944. And he connected Henry Wallace to the bomb, and there was a great story there, which he could tell. And as a result, it opened my eyes to why the bomb was dropped.
What was the Henry Wallace story?
Henry Wallace story? Well, Henry Wallace has been pretty much lost to history. When you ask students, you ask most people, they don't even know who Henry Wallace was. And Henry Wallace was one of the most remarkable figures in 20th century America. He was Secretary of Agriculture for the first two New Deal administrations in the 1930s. And then Roosevelt was running for president in 1940 for a third term. And he knew we were on the verge of a war against fascism, and he wanted a real progressive on the ticket. And he demanded Henry Wallace. And the convention refused to give him Wallace. And Roosevelt wrote a letter resigning, saying that if we already have one money-dominated conservative party, we don't need two. And I'm not going to be the candidate in this party. And fortunately, Eleanor Roosevelt went to the floor of the convention in Chicago and made sure they knew that he was serious. And so they put Wallace on the ticket. And then it was 1944, and the war was ending. They were getting close to the end of the war in July of 44. And Wallace was up for renomination as vice president again, but the party bosses wanted to get him off the ticket. They knew that Roosevelt wasn't going to survive another term, and they know how radical Wallace was. In 1941, Henry Luce writes this, the 20th century is going to be the American century. Wallace countered that. Wallace said, no, the 20th century must be the century of the common man. He called for a worldwide people's revolution, ending imperialism, colonialism.
And he even in this speech, I mean, Wallace is a fascinating figure.
Yes.
He compares the American Revolution and the Russian Revolution. He sort of steps through the different revolutions that are happening. But this gets to, I think, one of the criticisms that there's been of the series, and broadly of this kind of counter-narrative, right, which is about, in some ways, is a kind of revisionist history of the Cold War. I think that's a fair way of describing it. And it's a revisionist history that proceeds along lines that aren't novel if you have embedded yourself in the American left, right? I mean, that this kind of revisionist history has been there before. And the issue here is the recognition of the nature of the Soviet state, right? That Wallace was on the wrong side of history in this respect, that he was duped, that he went there, that he saw the Siberian work camps, and that they said, oh, it's all volunteer labor, that he wrote a book later in his life, right, saying, I was wrong, I got it wrong. He actually ends up endorsing Nixon and Eisenhower, right? Why should Wallace be this kind of visionary figure if he was wrong about the nature of the Soviet state, and that was such a defining issue, not just for the world at the time, but for the left specifically?
Well, he was not the only one who was wrong when he went to Magadan.
Right.
Also, the China experts who were on the trip and the Russia experts got it wrong. The military people on the trip got it wrong also, because they set it up to show him this Potemkin village, which was not the reality. He was not wrong on the big issues throughout his life. I mean, he's consistent on the big issues. And the big issues were, as you were saying,
racial integration. He was right about.
He was way ahead of his time in racial integration and ending colonialism. We could have ended colonialism much earlier and much more peacefully. The big issue was he was the leading spokesperson against the nuclear arms race when after he doesn't get the nomination, when they replace him with Truman, of all people, Wallace stays in the cabinet as Secretary of Commerce, and he fights from inside the cabinet for the next year to try to stop the Cold War from developing. He's right about that. If you read his writings, I mean, I think, and I've read them all during that time, I think he's right on every important position he takes. He tries to...
But then is he right when he later says, I was wrong?
No, that's the one time that's the one time he's not right. I mean, he was wrong about a few things. I mean, he got the labor camp wrong, but it's not a big deal. And it's not that he doesn't understand the nature of the Soviet Union. He thought that if the United States and the Soviets remained friends, because the important thing was the United States and Soviets collaborated very well during World War II. Right. I mean, one of the myths that people don't know, most Americans think that the United States won World War II militarily.
No, this is something that comes out in Untold History, and I think this part is really important, which is just the emphasis on what the Russian experience of World War II is, which has been, I think, largely written out of American history because we tend to focus on D-Day. But you talk about the Siege of Stalingrad, and I want you to talk about why the emphasis on that experience right after we take another break.
Oh, it goes too fast.
Talking about the untold history of the United States, and we've been discussing this idea of Hollywood as a center of myth-making about American history and the project of counter-myth, and I thought one of the places where I think this is the most important is your focus in the series on just the Russian experience of World War II, because it is, we don't think about it a lot when we think about World War II, and that partly is understandable. We're Americans. No. Why did you want to focus on the Russian experience?
Well, it's, the series of 10 hours is really about America.
Right.
And it's about, but Russia affects the Soviet Union is a huge role in this, and it changes us. It distorts us into a national security state. Right. But it starts in these first 3 chapters. You showed a clip of the bomb being tested at Alamogordo, and you show Oppenheimer there, looking at his watch.
Another endlessly
fascinating. That is a key moment. There's a reason. That's the founding moment. That is a myth, the founding myth, that we had to drop the atomic bomb on Japan to save American lives. We go to some length to deconstruct that myth, and it's very important that you understand that we did not have to. Japan was gone. It was finished. They were worried about the Russian invasion that was coming towards them from the mainland. And there was a serious invasion. They knocked out a major Japanese army. It was over. We dropped the bomb to tell the Russians, look, this is the new rules. This is a new war. You screw with us, and this is what you're going to get. You screw with us in Europe, you screw with us in Asia, this is your reward. And we were very barbaric in doing that. It was a clear signal to the Russians after they had been our allies in World War II. They did not deserve it, but they got the signal. Stalin was no fool. So this is important to understand. That's one myth. The other myth is what he was talking about was colonialism. It was the British Empire role in World War II, and what Churchill was fighting for. He wasn't interested in knocking out in putting up the Second Front to help the Russians. He was interested in getting the colonies back for England, all the way to India, Singapore, etc., and Iran, the oil supplies. That's what we have to go into. These 3 myths are very important to understand at the beginning of the series.
The nuclear era dawns, and it produces the National Security Act in 1947, and the construction of what is, I think, what the series describes as, and I think describes accurately, is essentially a permanent war state in the U.S.
Exactly.
How do you begin to undo a permanent war state?
Well, we go. There's 10 chapters here. We have very little time.
The way you begin to undo it,
bomb to 49 anyway.
The way you begin to undo it is to educate people about what the history really is. If people don't have a clear understanding of their history, then they're going to think that the way this has evolved was the way it had to evolve. What we're trying to show with Henry Wallace, with our treatment of John Kennedy, our discussion of what happens when Stalin dies on March 5th, 1953, we're showing that there are these pivotal moments when history could have been fundamentally different.
Yeah, that is one of the themes here, and one of the things I think is interesting and actually rankled me a little bit is that, a kind of the left approach to history has been both these kind of counter-narratives, but also the kind of rejecting this great man theory, right? I mean, the iconic Howard Zinn project is about history from the bottom up as opposed to great men calling the shots and their leadership kind of determining outcomes. But this series seems to hew very closely to a great man theory. I mean, while there are essentially saints and scoundrels, right? And when you have scoundrels in power, you get bad stuff, and the saints keep getting squelched. And my question is, do do you think fundamentally that is what history comes down to, these sort of pivotal moments with these pivotal characters?
There are some pivotal moments. The bomb was not made by the bottom up. It was made from the top down.
I mean, a lot of these things are done in secret, behind closed doors. The public couldn't have weighed in on the bomb because nobody knew that we were building the bomb. The Russians knew, but that's a different issue. So if you're going to deal with those kind of pivotal moments, you have to deal with the power players at the top. Now, other places we bring in, for example, when we talk about Nixon, we show how much Nixon was influenced by the anti-war movement. He was obsessed with the anti-war movement. It limited a lot of things that he did, fortunately. So we're not trying to downplay the social forces that are crucial. Howard Zinn was a huge fan of our project. We're very sorry he's not here to enjoy this with us. But it's the dialectic between.
But I sense in you as a filmmaker an approach to storytelling that is is not grounded in the sort of historiographical concern with these kind of large structural forces, but is more focused on these individuals. I mean, that's where you're coming from.
No, that's true. But that, it is a drama. Like Born on the 4th of July, it's a story about a man who gets a bullet in the. It's a very violent movie in one sense. He has a bullet he's wounded and he's paralyzed the rest of his life. It's about him. But when he joins them at the end of the movie, he goes into a movement, which was the anti-war movement in Vietnam, which Ron Kovic did join, and you did see the effect that these people had, as he said, on the policies and getting us out of the war. Those people worked. In the 60s, that worked, the protests. In the same way, I was going to say Reagan was influenced by the huge protests of nuclear freeze in the early 80s. So it does sometimes have an effect. 89 is a great moment. 1989, you were around, I think. Maybe not, but 1989 was an olive branch. I mean, George Bush, the father, had a moment when Gorbachev was saying, it's over.
Right.
In every country, the wall fell in every communist country. That was a wonderful moment, and what did Bush do? He invaded Panama the next month, and then he invaded Iraq the first time a year later.
Peter Kuznick from American University, collaborator on the Untold History of the United States 10-part series, and also a companion book, around 700 pages, that you can check out at bookstores. Thanks for coming in. Oliver, stick around for Now We Know if you don't mind. Sure. What do we know now we didn't know last week? My answers after this.
This week? Tell me something. What happened this week?